A mafia kingpin treats a pregnant woman like a civilian obstacle, only to realize he didn't just insult a stranger. He insulted the woman who owns the very air he breathes. The boutique doors slide open to reveal an arena of gold and marble. Robert Cruz enters, his neck tattoos and dark suit screaming danger, causing the staff to scatter. He feels untouchable until he encounters Debbie Kelly. Clad in a striking red dress that highlights her pregnancy, she stands her ground with a gaze so calm it should have been a warning. Robert's dismissive sneer and public mockery set a trap he doesn't see coming. He walks out thinking he won a petty argument, while Debbie simply watches him leave, already beginning the countdown to his empire's collapse. The glass doors of the boutique slid open with a soft, expensive chime, but the air inside curdled the moment Robert Cruz stepped over the threshold. He didn't just walk, he invaded. Behind him, two lieutenants trailed like shadows of a coming storm, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses. Robert adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, the intricate black ink of a dragon's tail peeking out from beneath his sleeve and curling up his tattooed throat like a warning. Every employee in the room stopped breathing. The golden chandeliers seemed to dim in the presence of a man who dealt in lead and cold blood. He walked in slowly, his steps echoing against the polished marble like the ticking of a countdown. People who crossed his path rarely looked him in the eye, those who did usually regretted it. He was halfway to the bespoke suit rack when he saw her, and the rhythm of his arrogance hit a snag. Debbie Kelly stood in the center of the aisle, a radiant figure in a crimson-red dress that clung to the prominent curve of her pregnant belly. She was examining a silk tie, her expression one of quiet, serene focus that made the entire store seem suddenly smaller, more intimate. To Robert, she was a localized blockage, a civilian hurdle in his private sanctuary. He stopped inches from her, his presence a physical weight that usually forced people to scatter. Debbie didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, her dark, almond-shaped eyes meeting his with a steady gaze that lacked even a flicker of the fear Robert feasted on. "The store is open to the public, sir," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "There is plenty of room to walk around me." A cruel, sharp smirk twisted Robert's lips. He looked over his shoulder at his men, who let out mocking chuckles, then turned back to Debbie with a gaze that intentionally stung. "Look at you," Robert sneered, loud enough for the trembling tailors to hear. "Waddling through a temple of luxury as if you belong here. This isn't a playground for the heavy and the helpless, sweetheart. You're taking up space that belongs to people who actually have a purpose." He leaned in closer, his tattooed neck tensing. "Go home and wait for the delivery. The Underworld doesn't have time for a woman who can't even see her own feet." He didn't wait for a response. With a dismissive flick of his hand, he brushed past her, his shoulder intentionally clipping hers as he headed toward the private lounge. He felt like a king. He didn't see that Debbie remained perfectly still, her hand resting protectively over her child. She didn't cry. Instead, she watched his reflection in the mirrored wall, recording every tattoo and every line of his face in her mind. Robert Cruz thought he had just insulted a shopper. He had no idea he had just given a face to the man whose empire she was about to dismantle. In the jagged concrete jungle of Soulside, the name Robert Cruz was not spoken so much as it was exhaled like a final, desperate breath. He was the apex predator of a kingdom built on neon and bone, a man whose reputation for calculated brutality served as the city's unofficial, blood-stained law. To cross Robert was to invite a structural dismantling of one's entire existence. He didn't just strike his enemies, he erased their future and salted the earth where they once stood. Those who walked the lower docks or navigated the high-rise boardrooms knew the tailies, the rival who disappeared during a peace talk, only for his entire fleet to be found scuttled and empty by dawn, or the snitch who learned too late that Robert's intricate neck tattoos were a ledger of every soul he had sent into the silence. His power was not merely in the guns his men carried, but in the psychological vacuum he created by simply entering a room. When Robert appeared, the natural vibration of life seemed to cease, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a panther, his tailored black suits concealing a body hardened by decades of street warfare and an unyielding ego. He thrived on the visible tremor in a man's hand and the way eyes invariably dropped to the floor when he passed. For Robert, Fear was the only currency that never devalued, and he spent it lavishly to keep his throne secure. He believed himself to be the architect of the underworld, the one man who could navigate the shadows without ever being swallowed by them. His lieutenants whispered that he was made of stone and ink, a king who had replaced his pulse with the cold, rhythmic ticking of a clock. Every shipment of high-end contraband and every illicit transaction flowed through his fingers, taxed by his will and protected by his name. In his mind, there was no force, legal or otherwise, that could challenge the gravity of his presence. He was the king of Soulside, a man who viewed the world as a collection of obstacles to be crushed, completely unaware that the truly powerful never feel the need to shout. The unraveling did not begin with a bang or a gunshot, but with the sterile, rhythmic chirping of a smartphone that wouldn't stop screaming. Robert sat in his high-tech command center, the neon blue light of the monitors reflecting off his tattooed throat, expecting the usual reports of successful smuggling runs and laundered tribute. Instead, the world began to glitch. A frantic call from the Inchin docks shattered the silence. His primary shipment of high-end contraband, a cargo worth more than the skyscraper he sat in, had been seized by unknown federal authorities who carried warrants that didn't exist an hour ago. There was no negotiation, no bribe large enough to move the needle. It was as if the ports themselves had grown teeth and bitten his hand off. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar weight, settled in his chest as he pivoted to his financial monitors. His fingers, heavy with gold rings, flew across the keyboard, pulling up his primary offshore accounts. The screen flickered, loading a reality he couldn't comprehend, a row of hollow, mocking zeros where 8-figure balances used to sit. The digital blood of his empire had been drained in a heartbeat. He refreshed the page, his breath hitching, but the vacuum remained. It wasn't just a hack, it was a surgical strike. Every ghost in the machine that Robert had relied on to stay invisible had suddenly turned into an executioner. His encrypted lines went dead one by one, and his most loyal fixers stopped answering their phones. The loud power he had wielded so effectively in the boutique was useless here, in the silent war of codes and logistics. He looked at his tattooed hands, realizing for the first time that they were empty. In the shadows of the city's infrastructure, a switch had been flipped by a hand he had called helpless, and the king of Soulside was being systematically erased from his own kingdom. The countdown Debbie Kelly had started wasn't a warning, it was already a funeral. The air in the penthouse was thick with the ozone of cooling hardware, and the sour sweat of a man realizing he was no longer a predator. Robert sat hunched over a sprawl of physical documents, having abandoned the digital screens that had already betrayed him. His tattooed fingers trembled as he tore through a leather-bound dossier his last loyal informant had delivered at a staggering cost. He was looking for a name, a ghost, a phantom, the person whose signature sat at the bottom of the master leases for his warehouses and the maritime insurance policies for his entire fleet. He found it on the third page of a Port Authority contract. The ink was elegant, the loops of the letters precise and unwavering. Debbie Kelly. Robert's breath hitched, a jagged sound that felt like glass in his throat. He threw the paper aside and grabbed a grainy surveillance photo pinned to the file. His vision blurred for a second as the world tilted on its axis. In the photo, a woman stood on the steps of a corporate plaza, her regal profile unmistakable even in the low resolution. She was wearing a familiar, vibrant crimson dress that draped over her pregnant silhouette. It was her, the civilian hurdle from the boutique. The woman he had sneered at, the one he had told to waddle home because the underworld had no time for her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow to the solar plexus. He hadn't just insulted a shopper, he had spat in the face of the master architect who owned the very ground his empire was built upon. Every ship he sailed, every crate he moved, and every dollar he laundered had been permitted only because she had allowed it. The quiet power he had dismissed as helpless was the hand that held his leash. Panic, cold and oily, flooded his system. He looked around his opulent office and suddenly saw it for what it was, a cage. He wasn't the king of Soulside. He was a tenant whose lease had just been canceled by a woman he had treated like dirt. For the first time in his life, Robert Cruz felt the walls closing in, and he knew that no amount of ink or muscle could save him from the storm he had invited into his home. The transition from the neon-choked alleys of the city to the sprawling, silent hills of the Kelly estate felt like crossing into another dimension. Robert drove himself, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his mind still fueled by a flickering, desperate embers of his old ego. He told himself he was going there to handle her, to use the raw, tattooed intimidation that had served him for a decade to force a negotiation. He expected a house full of soft silk and nursery rhymes. He expected to find a woman who would fold the moment he brought the scent of the underworld into her foyer. He was wrong before he even reached the front door. As his car crested the long, winding driveway, the gates didn't just open. They hissed with a mechanical precision that suggested military-grade security. Robert stepped out into the crisp, sun-drenched air, adjusting his suit jacket and preparing his most lethal scowl. But the silence of the estate was heavy, almost predatory. Before he could take 3 steps toward the marble entrance, the shadows of the manicured hedges seemed to come alive. They didn't shout, they didn't brandish weapons with the clumsy bravado of his own street soldiers. These were shadows in charcoal tactical gear, moving with the fluid, synchronized grace of a professional strike team. Within seconds, Robert was surrounded. He reached instinctively for the pistol tucked into his waistband, but a gloved hand moved with the speed of a viper, pinning his arm. A sudden, sharp pressure behind his knees buckled his legs, and for the first time in his adult life, the king of Soulside was forced into the dirt. His face was pressed near the gravel, his tattooed neck exposed and vulnerable. He struggled, a guttural snarl dying in his throat as he realized the men holding him didn't even care enough to look him in the eye. They weren't afraid of him. They didn't even recognize his legend. From the balcony above, the glass doors slid open. Debbie Kelly stepped out, draped in a flowing white gown that caught the morning light, her hand resting regally on her stomach. She looked down at him not with anger, but with the weary patience of a queen looking at a stray dog that had barked once too often. Robert, pinned and powerless, looked up at the helpless woman he had mocked, and for the first time he understood that he wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to survive. The sanctuary of Robert's high-rise headquarters, once a symbol of untouchable arrogance, had become a glass-walled coffin. Without Debbie Kelly's logistical protection, the invisible shield that had kept Robert's enemies at bay for a decade didn't just crack, it vanished. His rivals, the scavengers who had spent years flinching at the mere mention of his name, finally smelled the copper tang of blood in the air. They knew the king was bankrupt, his accounts frozen and his supply lines severed. For the first time, Robert Cruz was just a man, and in Soulside, a man without resources is a man without a life expectancy. The coup began with a coordinated symphony of violence. The ground floor lobby, once patrolled by Robert's elite guards, was overrun in minutes as rival syndicates merged into a single, predatory force. The elevators were cut, and the stairwells became narrow, concrete slaughterhouses. Inside his top-floor office, Robert listened to the muffled thud of grenades and the rhythmic stutter of automatic fire climbing the building. He looked at his tattooed hands, now gripping a weapon that felt useless against the tide of history turning against him. His remaining men, the few who hadn't fled the moment the bank accounts hit zero, looked to him for a plan, but his eyes were fixed on the panoramic windows. Then the glass shattered. A hail of high-caliber rounds shredded the expensive silk curtains and pulverized the marble desks. Robert dived behind an overturned oak table, his black suit quickly becoming stained with the dust of his crumbling empire. He fired back, his tattooed neck tensing with every desperate pull of the trigger, but for every rival he dropped, 3 more emerged from the smoke. His headquarters was no longer a seat of power, it was a burning pyre. As the ceiling sparked and the smell of ozone and gunpowder filled his lungs, Robert realized the bitter truth. He had spent his life building a kingdom of cards, and the woman he had called helpless had been the only wind keeping it upright. Now that she had stepped away, the fire was taking everything, and the king of Soulside was about to be cremated in the ruins of his own pride. The rain over Soulside didn't fall, it drowned. It washed away the soot of the burning headquarters and the last vestiges of Robert's manufactured divinity. He stood before the iron gates of the Kelly estate once more, but the black Lamborghini was gone, replaced by a stolen, dented sedan that mirrored his own fractured state. His tailored suit was a rag of wool and dried blood, and the fierce ink on his neck seemed to pale against the gray, freezing downpour. He didn't come with a scowl or a demand this time. He stood in the camera's unblinking eye, his hands open and trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the humility he had to swallow to keep his remaining brothers alive. When the gates finally hissed open, it wasn't a tactical team that met him, but a silence more profound than any gunshot. He was led into a warm, amber-lit study that smelled of old books and expensive cedar, a stark contrast to the copper-scented chaos he had fled. Debbie sat in a high-backed velvet chair, her silhouette framed by the storm raging against the window behind her. She didn't look like a victim or a shopper. She looked like a judge. Robert didn't wait for her to speak. He sank to the floor, his knees hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud that echoed his internal collapse. "My life for theirs," he rasped, his voice a jagged shadow of its former resonance. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the steady, calm eyes of the woman he had once called helpless. "The ports, the streets, the names, you have it all but my men. They followed a fool. They don't deserve to burn for my pride." He offered his tattooed hands toward her, wrists crossed in a silent invitation for shackles. "I will be your shadow. I will be the blade you used to keep the peace I broke. I'll be the monster at your door so no one else has to be. Just save them." In the heavy stillness that followed, the loud power of the King of Soulside was officially buried. He wasn't a king making a treaty. He was a man begging for the chance to be a shield for the only power that mattered. Robert Cruz had finally realized that the debt of his protection wasn't paid in gold, but in the total surrender of his soul to the queen he had dared to ignore. The peace of the Kelly estate was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent distortion of the horizon. The rival syndicates, emboldened by Robert's fall and desperate to decapitate the shadow matriarch before she could install a new order, descended upon the grounds with the fury of a dying storm. The glass-walled conservatory, where Debbie sat reviewing the new trade manifests, became a terrifying cage of vulnerability as the first high-caliber rounds whistled through the air. Robert moved before the first pane of glass had even finished vibrating. The man who had once swaggered through boutiques with a sneer was gone, replaced by a living weapon of pure, singular focus. He didn't reach for his own safety. He lunged across the mahogany desk, his tattooed hands, once symbols of vanity, now acting as iron anchors as he pulled Debbie toward the reinforced concrete floor. The air was a chaotic symphony of lead and splintering wood. Robert felt the hot sting of a bullet graze his shoulder, but he didn't falter. He shielded her body with his own, his broad back a wall of ink and muscle between her and the window. The breach happened fast. 3 masked gunmen burst through the shattered frame, their sights fixed on the woman who had dared to dismantle their world. Robert didn't hesitate. He rose from the debris like a vengeful ghost, drawing the silver pistol he had kept as his final mercy. He fired 3 times, each shot a precise exclamation point of his lethal intent, but as the final assassin fell, a hidden 4th shooter in the tree line squeezed a desperate trigger. The impact was a dull, heavy thud against Robert's chest. He didn't cry out. He simply stiffened, his jaw clenching as he felt the warmth of his own blood begin to soak through his tattered suit. He stayed upright just long enough to ensure the perimeter was clear, his gaze locked on Debbie's startled but steady eyes. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a sign of her weakness, but for confirmation of her safety. As the Kelly tactical team swarmed the room to finish the job, Robert slumped against a stone pillar, his breath a shallow rasp. He had spent his life dealing in death for the sake of his ego, but in the fading light of the siege, he realized that the only thing worth dying for was the woman who had finally taught him how to serve. The recovery was a slow, quiet baptism in the white halls of the Kelly private wing. Robert had spent his life believing that scars were badges of conquest, but as Debbie personally oversaw his care, he learned they were something else, a debt. She didn't just heal his flesh, she recalibrated his soul. With a few decisive strokes of her pen, she restored the ghost shipments to the docks and unfroze the accounts, breathing life back into the skeletal remains of his syndicate. The empire was reset, but the crown had fundamentally changed hands. The king had died in the siege, and in his place stood a man who finally understood the weight of the air he breathed. Weeks later, the glass doors of the luxury boutique slid open with the same expensive chime as before. The staff froze, a collective shiver of memory running through the room as they recognized the charcoal suit and the intricate, dark ink curling up Robert's throat. They braced for the invasion, for the loud power and the dismissive sneers that usually preceded a storm. But the storm never came. Debbie Kelly entered first, draped in a regal gown of deep royal purple that flowed around her like a midnight tide. She walked with the effortless, silent authority of a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be obeyed. And there, exactly 3 steps behind her, walked Robert Cruz. His hands were clasped respectfully at his front, his head slightly bowed, his eyes alert but fixed on her path. The aggressive, gold-ringed finger he had once pointed in mockery was now steady and still. He was no longer the apex predator hunting for a throne. He was the Iron Shadow, the silent guardian who ensured that the ground beneath her feet remained unshakable. As they passed the silk racks where he had once insulted her, Robert didn't look at the clothes or the trembling tailors. He looked only at the woman who had dismantled his world to show him his place within it. When a young clerk stepped forward to assist, Robert stepped back, clearing the way with a subtle, graceful deference. The boutique was the same, the gold and marble were the same, but the hierarchy had been rewritten in blood and service. The King of Soulside had finally found his true crown, and it was found in the honor of walking in her wake.